Switch on? I think it's on.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to switch it off so I can.
Oh, switch it off. Okay.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Daan Hovens will defend the academic thesis, Power Dynamics at Work, an ethnography of a multilingual metro foundry in the Dutch-German borderland. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Sehr geehrte Prorektor, sehr geehrte Mitglieder van de Corona, sehr geehrte familie, vrienden, collega's en alle mensen die deze veranstaltung online en offline kijken. In de nächste 15 minuten zal ik een overzicht van mijn dissertatie presenteren met de titel Machtsdynamieken aan het werk, een ethnografie van een meersprakige metaalgieterij in het Nederlands-Duitse grensland. Zuerst zal ich kurz was über die Metallgieterei in het algemeen erzählen. Zweitens zal ich het begrip Machtsdynamieken bij je erklären. Drittens sage ich was über die Sprachpraktiken op de Arbeitsplatz. En zum Schluss bespreche ich de vraag wie zeer de sprachliche diversiteit in het probleem nou eigenlijk een probleem doorstelde of niet. Maar also eerst de metaalgieterij in het algemeen. De metaalgieterij is, wie gezegd, gelegen in het Nederlands-Duitse grensland. De metaalgieterij was gelegen aan de Nederlandse zijde van de grens. Als ik in 2017 mijn onderzoek of forschung in de metaalgieterij maakte, werkten er meer dan 300 productiewerkers. En van die productiearbeiders had etwas meer dan de helft de Nederlandse nationaliteit, etwas meer als een kwart of een viertel had de Duitse nationaliteit en de overige arbeiders hadden ofwel de Polnische of een andere nationaliteit. Nationaliteiten zeggen aber ja niet alles over de sprachen die mensen spreken. Zo hoorde ik tijdens mijn onderzoek unter anderem Nederlands, Duits en Limburgs, aber ook Engels, Polnisch, Russisch, Turks, Arabisch, Grieks, etc. Deze diversiteit was vor allem groot onder de zeitarbeiter of uitzendkrachten, die meer dan de helft van alle productiearbeiders uitmachten. Waarom is het nou interessant om een arbeidsplaats wie deze metaalgieterij zo ausführlich te studeren? Zuerst, het gibt veel arbeidsplätze wie de metaalgieterij heute, wo veel verschiedene mensen met veel verschiedene sprachliche Hintergründe zusammenarbeiten. En wo veel zeitarbeiter of uitzendkrachten zijn. Daarom is het also wertvoll om heraus te vinden wie al deze mensen in de lage zijn om ihre arbeid gedaan te krijgen. En wie solche arbeidsplaatsen gemanaged werden. Genau uit deze grond heb ik de vraag gesteld wie machtsdynamieken op deze arbeidsplaats ontstaan, damit we besser verstehen kunnen wie zo'n metaalgieterij eigenlijk productief wordt. Ik zal het begrip machtsdynamieken nou bij je erklären. Een origineel aspect van mijn dissertatie is dat ik een zogenaamd posthumanistisch perspectief aangewend heb. Naar dit perspectief passiert er gar niks, wenn verschiedene mensen en niet-mensen niet miteinander samenarbeiten. Zum Beispiel, producten van een metaalgieterij zullen niet entstehen kunnen wanneer verschiedene mensen, machines en gereedschappen of werkzeugen niet samenarbeiten. Macht kan daarom onmogelijk in bezit zijn, aber is een gevolg van interacties tussen verschiedene menselijke en niet-menselijke actoren. Een ander duidelijkes Beispiel dafür is dat keine Einfachmachheit is dat het management van de metaalgieterij hier wil dat meer productiearbeiter Nederlands spraken of leerden, aber dat het in de alltag nog weinig passierte. In de nächste sectie zal ik dan erklären wat er dan schon in de metaalgieterij gesproken wordt. also Sektie 3. Wie gesagt, worden er veel verschillende Sprachen in de Metalltheorie gesprochen. Wanneer ze mich nur fragst, welche Sprache aber am meisten gesprochen wird, dann zou ich sagen, dass das Deutsch war. Wanneer ich Deutsch sage, meine ich aber nicht unbedingt Standarddeutsch, sondern iedere vorm van Deutsch die niet immer alle grammaticale regels van het Standarddeutsch volgt en elementen van het Nederlands, Limburgs en ook andere sprachen hebben kennen. 2 Beispiele van mijn veldwertdata zien. Hey, was ist los? Krank kaputt? En dan wollen wir even een hammer en een schraubenzieher. Wie man sehen kennt, geven bestimmte Schlüsselwörter, die veel mensen in de metaalgieterij leren en gebruiken, ongeacht welke spraak ze wij spreken. Een soort van metaalgieteriespraak. Een Beispiel is also het woordje kraan, dat verwijst naar een takel die ik hier op een foto in de hand haal. Also duidelijk een woordje met een praktische functie voor de arbeid. Een ander Beispiel is de uitroep ma. Een soort Limburgse wijze om scherzhaft op iemand te reageren die gerade wat falsch gedaan heeft, zum Beispiel wat vallen gelaten heeft. Deze uitroep had duidelijk een wat meer sociale functie op de arbeidsplaats. De zogenaamde metaalgieteriespraak vervult dus duidelijk een aantal bedürfnissen die op deze arbeidsplaats bestaan. Maar niet nur dat. De metaalgieteriespraak beantwoordt ook aan specifieke omstandigheden op de arbeidsplaats, wie zum Beispiel de helle geluiden of de laute Geräusche van de machine. Het is waarschijnlijk also geen toeval dat gerade een uitroep met zo'n kort en repetitief karakter wie maar in deze spraak verschijnt. Zum Schluss moet ook nog gezegd worden dat de metaalgieteriespraak natuurlijk geen volledige spraak was. En dat deze op grond van het grote aantal zeitarbeiter of uitzendkrachten dat waarschijnlijk ook nooit wäre. En zo komen we ooit bij de vraag wie zeer de språkliche diversiteit in de metaalgieterij nou een probleem doorstelde of niet. Wie gesagt, war de häufigst gesprochene Sprache op de arbeidsplaats Deutsch. De häufigst geschriebene Sprache dagegen war Standard-Nederlands, zum Beispiel bei Mededelingen en Arbeitsinstructies. Es gab aber auch ein paar Ausnahmen, wie zum Beispiel diese teilweise gegoogelt translate Mededeling op het foto. Der sind het Nederlands, Duits, Russisch, Turks en Grieks. Doch in het algemeen kan man sagen, dat mensen die weder Nederlands, noch Duits, noch Limburgs verstaan kosten, het mogelijk het zwaarst hadden in deze omgeving. Op deze grond vond ik het dan ook wat verrassend of bemerkenswert dat het of gerade Nederlands en Duits sprekende mensen waren die me sagten dat ze de spraaksituatie op de arbeidsplaats een groot probleem vonden. Mensen waarvan man vielleicht verwachtet, dass sie mehr Schwierigkeiten damit hatte, wie zum Beispiel Polnisch und Englisch sprechende Menschen, sagten oft, dass sie die Sprachsituatie gar nicht so problematisch fanden. Und das führt dann natürlich zu der Frage, wie das Unterschied erklärt werden kann. Aber auch zu der Frage, was dann jetzt genau passiert, wenn ihr diese Menschen auf der Arbeitsplatz zusammenarbeiten müssen. Op deze grond behalten we in de dissertatie ook een aantal casusstudies van bestimmte concrete situaties die während mijn onderzoek of forschung in de metaalgieterij geschehen zijn. En obwohl ik niet alle details en nuances van deze casusstudies hier bespreken kan ik schon een paar algemene observaties delen. Maar ik zou zeggen, neem vooral het boek en lees het ook. Ze zeigen de studies duidelijk de grote wereld van observatie, hypothetiseren en testvaardigheden en met verschillende communicatieve situaties op de arbeidsplaats om te gaan. En wij zeigen de studies ook een Beispiel van wie machine de rol van mentor op zich kunnen nemen door verbaal en non-verbaal aan te geven waar man sicher of veilig schon en lopen kan. Ja. Zum Schluss wil ik hier nog een paar ideeën of gedanken met u delen die op grond van mijn studie in de laatste 4 jaar ontstaan zijn. Zuerst, wie meine Präsentation heute auch gezeigt hat, brauchen Menschen sich eine ganze Sprache zu sprechen, sich selbst doch verständlich zu machen. En bepaalde doelen of Zwecke van ihrer Kommunikatie te bereiken. Zweitens, inklusiv Sprachgebrauch will also auch nicht unbedingt sagen, dass man volledig naar eine andere Sprache wechselt. Es gibt viele verschiedene Weisen of manieren om met verschillende mensen rekening te houden. Drittens, een mogelijke implicatie voor spraakpolitiek en spraakonderricht hiervan kan zien dat men zum Beispiel in een Nederlands-Duitse constellatie meer nadruk erop legt zich sprakelijk een beetje te leren aan te passen, staat in de ganze spraak te leren. Dat maakt de educatie een stukje einfacher of makkelijker, vielleicht voor sommige mensen. Viertens, waar verschillende mensen samenkomen, zullen zij bestimmte sprakelijke artefacten, wie maar, en technologische artefacten ontwikkelen die ihre interacties onderling en met onder andere machines effectiever maken. Aber de dissertatie zeigt ook op verschillende wijzen dat de flexibilisering van de arbeidsmarkt van sprakelijke diversiteit een groter probleem maakt als het aan zich zou zien. Zum Beispiel, weil mensen weniger tijd hebben om een gemeenschappelijke spraak te ontwikkelen. En manchmal ook weniger motivatie hebben om er veel energie in te steken. De vervlechting van flexibilisering en sprakelijke diversiteit op arbeidsplaatsen wie deze met targeterie zou mogelijk ook deels verklaren kunnen waarom bestimmte groepen deze diversiteit meer problematisch vonden als andere. Uiteindelijk of letztendlich is het essentieel om ook met deze politiek, economische, wirtschaftliche situatie rekening te houden. Immers, ongeacht welke spraakpolitiek een bedrijf weet, wanneer mensen denken dat deze politiek ihre belangen of interesse niet entspricht, dan zal dit de arbeidsplaatscommunicatie ja ook niet zo goed komen. Veel dank voor uw aufmerksamheid. And then I will now give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Mazzucato. Professor Mazzucato holds a chair in globalization and development at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, I'm afraid I'm going to ask my question in English and not in Limburgisch. I want to first of all say that I really enjoyed reading your thesis. It is particularly well written. It shows that you've mastered a diverse theories and concepts that you engage with, and these coming from different disciplines was no small feat. You clearly situate yourself within these disciplines and the debates that they raise with respect to multilingual environments. I also really appreciated the fieldwork that you did, the 3.5 months that you spent in a metal foundry. Your descriptions of the field, the noise, the smells, the difficulties of the work were very evocative. But now my question, and being the first one, I'm going to ask a sort of broad question. So despite the thoroughness with which you approached your theoretical and conceptual and concepts in your thesis, I was surprised by your choice of phrasing of the research question, which puts power dynamics so central. So in the introduction on page 15, and now I'm talking about the manuscript that you sent us, not the book, but anyway, you define power dynamics as interactions between humans or humans and machines, which produce particular effects and which create a hierarchy between actants. So in chapter 5, you do discuss this power in the theoretical section, but what I was missing is a more theoretical reflection on the role of power dynamics in the first and the second empirical chapters. So chapters 3 and 4 of the thesis. So my question is, could you explain to us what the concept of power dynamics brought to your thesis? What did it add to your insights? And maybe explain this with the illustrations of chapters 3 and 4. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for the giving me the opportunity to reflect upon this question. I think you're right that, for example, power dynamics, I used the term explicitly in chapter 1, the introduction, and I use it explicitly in the conclusion, chapter 6, and apart from that, it only appears in chapter 5 as an empirical chapter. In the other chapters, I don't use the term explicitly. I think what power dynamics, why power dynamics is in the research question and in the title of this dissertation is because I have to I think that power dynamics is a core theme in my dissertation that shows up in different disguises, in different shapes in each chapter. So you specifically ask about chapter 3 and 4. So in chapter 3, power dynamics shows up in the sense of center periphery, that I reflect upon this idea of center periphery and how this dichotomy is actually, I complexify this dichotomy a bit by bringing in this idea of a landscape. And in chapter 4, it's about these human-machine interactions, where it also gets clear, like, machines are not simply tools controlled by human beings. They also have agency on their own. They also do things on their own. So I would say, like, it's more that the different chapters, each in their own way, bring out something about power dynamics. So I would say it's rather more the other way around, maybe, that the different chapters show a different aspect or a different insight about power dynamics rather than the other way around. That's the way I think about the term, and that's the way that I've used it in my dissertation, and why it also ends up in the title and in the research question in this way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a nice overview. Thank you. And but maybe I'm interested in this notion of hierarchy, right? Because that's I would say the essence of power and power dynamics. So maybe if you could talk about, for example, in chapter 4, where you're talking about these dynamics between humans and machines, how do you determine what the hierarchy is?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, of course. Like, how do you determine what the hierarchy is? Like, I think in the introduction chapter, I also start with this example of Bruno Latour, which is like, but okay, let's stick to the example for my thesis. Like, there's this, there is this machine that kind of, when you walk or stand somewhere where you're not supposed to stand or walk, then this machine turns itself off. And in that way, it kind of clearly shows also, like, okay, like, who is in control here actually? Like, that's already a question that you can raise. Like, it's not just machines are not just tools, tools made by machines. Once you've made a machine, then these things have a life on their own. They start doing things that you maybe never intended them to do, and they might do certain things or not do certain things. Regardless of whatever the original intentions might have been or not. When it comes to hierarchies, well, there is this control panel of the machine where there's clearly, like, this distinction between languages and also between non-verbal communication. That there are a lot of buttons on the machine that have Dutch descriptions and that don't really have clear non-verbal indications, and then you have this one button that has English explanation underneath it, and that has a clear non-verbal indication. And with that, you can already see, like, and this button that has this clear non-verbal indication and this English description is like the safety button. It's like the emergency stop button. So from that, you can kind of say, like, oh, this through this machine, people who don't understand Dutch, they can still kind of save their lives, or they can still kind of work safely. But this machine doesn't really help them very much to become a bit more sophisticated workers, to learn a bit more how to interact with this machine. However, the machine also starts to live a life on its own. People press certain buttons that leave certain traces. Someone who is here today has pointed that out to me before. There's clear fingerprints on the buttons, and that's something like, okay, that's regardless of whoever has ever intended that. And also these fingerprints kind of indicate, like, oh, this is a button that is pressed a lot. And in this way, this machine also kind of helps you to get a bit of a sense of, like, oh, this might be a useful button to press. Okay.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Pennycook, who is Emeritus Professor of Language, Society and Education at the University of Technology in Sydney.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to see you again, Dan. It's a long time since we got to talk in New Zealand some years ago. So first, I want to just reiterate what was said, that to congratulate you on what's such an interesting thesis. I was kind of jealous because we wanted to do research in construction sites, and it got too hard. And to have done that research in the metalworks, I think is in itself is fascinating and a great achievement. And I think what has already been said, I mean, you cover a lot of very interesting theoretical ground in a very clear and positive way. It's very easy to read. And you bring together, I think, the new and the old materialism, which I think is a really important question for us now. These questions of machines and so on, and the questions of how we understand the new work order and so on. So I think it's a fascinating thesis, and I really congratulate you on that. But to my question, and thank you too for that talk in Limburgish, which I understood a lot of it actually, which I don't know why. Now I speak German, so you know it was great to hear that. So my question, on page 13, and that's in the first version we got, and it's nice you bring in this data, which is sort of unconventional for a thesis to have the data early. I like it. Some traditionalists won't, but I thought it was great to kind of get a bit of data and get a sense of what's going on. So you have this discussion, and then you raise various questions, which I thought you never actually answered. So I wanted to ask the answer to one of them. So page 13, you ask this. You say, who seems to be more insecure about his job in the end? Is it Per, who's one of the Udergarde, the older local Limburgish-speaking worker, or Win, who's one of the younger workers from Poland? Who is more insecure? So my question is really, how does the thesis, with the focus on assemblages, machines, and language varieties, how does it answer that question?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and also for giving me the opportunity to reflect upon this question. I think, clearly Per and Win, the two people in this introduction, they come from a different position. Per is a permanent worker, clearly, who has worked in the foundry for a very long time. While Win, I suppose he already comes to the Netherlands from Poland with the kind of idea like that he is going to do all kind of different jobs there. And I guess, for Per, I think being in a position as someone who has a permanent contract and also having experience during the past 20 years or something, that even when you have a permanent contract, when you have this relatively safe position, you would say that this actually doesn't guarantee that you stay in the foundry. I guess that gives more the insecurity because you have something to lose there. Well, I think Win kind of comes, he already is, he is already there with this idea like, okay, I now work here and next time I work there and like things will be all right. Like I will manage. So they come from a different position because of the different, the different position they have in this whole political economic situation. And I think for Per, I guess he feels more like he has something to lose in this respect. And in the end, it's this permanent contract that is maybe one of the few things that is some kind of protective shield around him. In the end, also I don't know, I can also imagine it's that he might also just adjust the situation, and some workers might be more a bit younger, a bit more fit. I don't know. That can be all kind of reasons why you feel like, okay, if it's not for this permanent contract, how much is there still to shield me apart from maybe this expertise I have to interact with the machines, maybe apart from this language. And I guess that's also why these things maybe show up as important things that he also tries to protect at several moments in the data. So these are just some questions, offer some answers that now just spontaneously come up in my mind. But what do you think?
I mean, you've answered that very much in terms of maybe the old materialism in terms of contracts and job security and so on. but how does that operate in terms of the language varieties? And Per has more capital, possibly in his knowledge of Limburgish, possibly not, right? And German and so on. And in the assemblages around the machines, how does that come into that sense of permanence or non-permanence in their work?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, indeed, like you say, like when you come and work in the metal foundry, then gradually there's all kind of interactions that that you have to get used to. And I guess there's a bit like this contrast, like on the superficial level, you can say like, oh, when you're like there's this clear idea that's communicated in several ways in the foundry that people are supposed to accommodate to Dutch. But when you look at what happens in real life, that doesn't really happen. It's rather that Per in this case is adapting a bit to that English situation. But that's like one dimension. But then the other dimension is like with these interactions, there's also the human-machine interaction. And that's like, if you also think of that as some kind of language or some kind of interaction that you have to learn in this work environment, then that's something that maybe he's still kind of like he is a bit more familiar with, or where he still has some kind of capital, so that there's maybe some kind of, yeah, that you can, if you bring those dimensions together, like what is the language capital here, or like how can we kind of negotiate about what is the capital that matters most here. I think maybe you can look at the data in such a way that you can see it also as an interaction or a negotiation about what is defined as the capital in the end. That's the most important thing in the end. Like maybe that's a way to bring in the new materialist element a bit more in that answer. Yeah,
that's good. That's good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Janus Mortensen, who is Associate Professor of Language Policy at the University of Copenhagen.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, in line with my esteemed colleagues, I would like to start out by congratulating you on a mighty fine piece of work. I enjoyed reading your dissertation. It's theoretically stimulating, empirically exciting, and enormously joyful to read. I like, in particular, I think, what I think of as theoretical curiosity. Some of the theoretical terms that you employ in the dissertation have already been discussed, and I like the way that you sort of take them one by one, more or less, and you look at them and you say, what can this do for me? But partly because your thesis is article-based, some of the theoretical terms are sort of confined to specific chapters, so they do get to do work in some areas, but not in all areas. So my question goes towards theoretical concepts, when and why to apply them. And I would like specifically to focus on the notion of transience. So transience plays a role in chapter 4 on workplace learning through human-machine interaction. It plays a role in chapter 5 on emergent project work assemblages. But there's no place, explicitly at least, for transience in chapter 3 on language policy and linguistic landscaping. And this makes sense, I think. When you're working from a linguistic ethnographic starting point, you need to let sort of the data guide you, and then the theory will have to follow suit, and whatever makes sense in that context will then be applied. I completely agree with you. But I'm sure you will also agree with me that sometimes it's useful to reflect upon how the theoretical concepts that we do bring to our analyses help shape those analyses, and how the absence of certain theoretical perspectives might similarly influence what we see and don't see, and what we give attention to and what we give less attention to. So, in brief, my question is, what could the notion of transience have done for your analysis in the chapter on language policy and linguistic landscaping? And how does the analysis you provide in that chapter potentially speak back to the notion of transience and challenge some of the ways that you apply transience in other parts of the dissertation?
The esteemed opponent, Thank you very much for this question, and also for your kind words. Yeah, I think you're very right. I think actually now that you are talking about it, I think the notion of transience can actually add a lot also to chapter 3. I think because exactly like people like you and others who have worked with this notion of transience, they can give you a very clear idea how people in transient situations and situations that are characterized by transience, what the language practices look like. And of course, any kind of language policy should kind of take that into account. So a language policy should be based on what's realistic, what can happen in practice. So I do think in that sense, like, yes, you can very rightfully ask the questions like, in a transient situation, what should a language policy look like as opposed to a non-transient situation? So I think in that way, yeah, I think you're correct. I think it could have added something still in that regard. You want me still to elaborate, or should I go to the? Yeah, I will elaborate. I think one thing I noticed, one thing that's also I've come to think about is just like, in the end, it doesn't matter so much what exact language policy you use in a workplace, but what matters is that there's of course some consistency between the language policy and the hiring policy that you have. And then something I can think of is like, for example, 3 possible scenarios. So the first scenario would be like a bit like the old days of Tomato Foundry, that you say like, oh, I just have a very strong preference for particular kind of workers, for example, Dutch-speaking workers. That's a policy you can go for. But then, of course, you need to offer very competitive salaries in order to attract specifically those workers that you want to. And I guess there's a reason why a lot of workplaces don't do that. I guess a lot of workplaces find it difficult to offer those salaries. So then, yeah, this language policy is then difficult to achieve. And the second option is that you say like, okay, I cannot offer those salaries to attract Dutch-speaking workers only. I'm also going to hire non-Dutch-speaking workers, but I'm going to have this policy that those people have to learn Dutch. That's my policy. In the end, I want everyone here to learn Dutch. It's possible, it's a possible language policy, but of course there has to be a consistency with the hiring policy. In that case, you cannot work with mainly temporary workers. You need to have more permanent workers and also invest in those language courses, etc. So it's an option, but yeah. But then the third scenario, in case you say like, okay, I cannot offer these very high salaries to hire Dutch-speaking people only, I also don't have this possibility for whatever reason to hire mainly permanent workers. Because I just need to adapt to this changing demand for products or whatever. Then, of course, the language policy also needs to be consistent with that. And then you're talking about a language policy that is adapted to transients. And then, yeah, I think that's one takeaway in terms of language policy for workplaces like this. Like, think of a consistency between the language policy and the hiring policy. And I think there the term transients can be very useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Lotte Tisse, who is lecturer in linguistics and anthropology at the School of Public Health here at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, beste Daan, van harte proficiat met het afrooien van die proefschrift en die PhD-traject. Ik vond het heel erg leuk om die boek te lezen en ik heb heel erg genoten van de persoonlijke stijl. En ook, ik heb het vaak moeten lachen eigenlijk en dat was wel heel erg leuk. I will switch to English now. You underline the importance of ethnographic insights for workplace policies, and you show that in-depth understanding of specific critical cases can teach us valuable lessons, such as how large societal and political economic trends play out at the micro level of the workplace. And based on your empirical work, you also propose how corporate policies and intervention could respond to ensure a pleasant, safe, and inclusive workplace for all employees. And this brings me to my question. In your dissertation, you succeed in providing insights into emerging power dynamics at the metal foundry between human and non-human actors who use all sorts of linguistic resources. Besides this, you discuss how these power dynamics can have a more positive force, contributing to productivity, to workplace safety, and to job satisfaction. This link, however, remains a little bit associative throughout your PhD, and you do not seem to theorize on these notions. So, for instance, with regards to workplace safety, Girardi and Nicolini have written in 2000, and I quote, "Safety can be viewed as an emerging property of a socio-technical system, the final result of a collective process of construction, a doing, which involves people, technologies, and textual and symbolic forms assembled within a system of material relations." So this means that safety is not just about following or breaking standardized rules, but is rather an assemblage, as you would call it. And the same holds true, I think, for the notion of job satisfaction, which should not be taken on face value, but rather seen as an assemblage that includes language practices, experiences of belonging and unbelonging, and general well-being. So therefore, I would like to invite you to reflect for a moment on these notions and how, within the metal foundry, these notions were assembled in specific language cultural, but also post-human ways.
Ali, esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question, and also very much, thank you very much for these kind words. Also happy to hear that that you enjoy some of the jokes that have been hidden a little bit in the text here and there. Can I repeat your question just to make sure that I've understood it correctly? So you asked me to reflect upon this idea that that these power dynamics or these different interactions that they have consequences for things like safety, productivity, job satisfaction, and those last three terms. I didn't conceptualize them, and then you asked me to, can I elaborate a bit more on that? That's okay. Yeah, indeed. Like I think you're right to point out that I didn't use those terms as concepts, as academic concepts. It was more a way to kind of give a little bit of an idea of like, oh, these are possible applications or implications of my works, more as more like an argument, like, oh, this is why it can be relevant to look at things like this, without going in detail about how you can all conceptualize it. So it's like I didn't intend to present those things as concepts, but I understand very well that yeah, it will lead to lead readers to think that. So what exactly do you mean when you use those terms? Yeah, I need to think about this for a moment, like how I'm going to approach this this answer. Yeah, I think it's what you mentioned is like that. It's not so much about following particular rules, and I think that's true. I guess also like a lot of people in this audience will also recognize that job satisfaction doesn't come with just following certain rules. Like I don't know if I just if at some point I hear I know if I, for example, say like, oh, some of the workers in the foundry, they liked it that the founding father, that for example, that he spoke Limburgish with them or something, and that should kind of draw the conclusion from that, like, oh, if I speak Limburgish, then people will be satisfied. Of course, that's a simplified reality. It doesn't work like that. So there's no like clear rules, like if I do this, then this. It's always like, yeah, as you mentioned, an assemblage. There's a lot of different things coming together that creates a situation that you can maybe describe as productive, as satisfactory, as safe, as whatever. So I would be very disappointed if people read my dissertation and they would draw these kind of conclusions from it. I think there's also a reason why at the end of my presentation I didn't want to use the word conclusions anymore, because I felt like yeah, I use the word lingering thoughts because I think like the point of my dissertation is not that people should draw some kind of simple rules based on this experience and say like, oh, so we should speak Limburgish and then everyone is happy or something. Like, it doesn't work like that. So I think like, yeah, assemblage also helps to kind of become aware of all the different possible interactions and all the different possible actants that are involved when it comes to creating an atmosphere where you can kind of feel like, okay, this is, I like working here, it's safe here or whatever. That's all these terms that you can think of and that can make you think like, yeah, this is a work environment where I want to work and where I feel like working, etc., etc. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. You get very tricky questions. And now the opposition will be continued by Professor Sari Pitikainen, who is Professor of Discourse Studies at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. Please.
Many thanks. I too want to congratulate you for completing such a successful, rich ethnographic research on the dynamics of material and multilingual communication at the factory work. The study very productively applies and further develops some of the key concepts in sociolinguistics and puts them, what I think, in a very fruitful dialogue with the recent research on the neoliberal conditions of the work. Your thesis also presents some very promising engagements with post-humanist scholarship, as well as research on power dynamics. And it is this aspect of your work that I would like to ask a little bit more. So in your introduction, you describe post-humanism as an attempt to decenter the human subject in the humanities and social sciences. You also write that your dissertation considers what a post-humanist approach to power and language can bring us in terms of insights about our research proceedings and data. So my question to you is that now with the hindsight after doing this research, what do you think that are the main insights of the post-humanism to language and power on the one hand, and to the research proceedings and data on the other?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for asking this question. Also nice to see you once, by the way. I know you from articles. Now I see you also in person once online. Yeah, what does my dissertation bring in terms of theory and method? So first of all, like any theory, I think post-humanism gives you a language. It brings you language. It gives you a vocabulary, and this vocabulary, like any language, it's not deterministic, but it helps you to maybe see certain things or pay attention to certain things that you might not notice otherwise, or it encourages you to maybe think in certain directions, think in certain ways. And a central thing that this post-humanism does is to make you think about agency in different ways, not only as agency in terms of like that only human beings have it, but also like other things than human beings have agency. It helps you think about language in a broader way. And like, okay, I will make it concrete again. Like before we talked about this control panel of the machine. I already talked about it in an earlier answer. So you have this control panel where you have different languages being used, different non-verbal signs being used. I guess that part is something that a non-post-humanist analyst would also have been able to point out. Like when a non-post-humanist analyst looks at this control panel, then I'm sure that this person would also be able to say like, oh, it's interesting, here you use Dutch and here you use English. So for that, you don't really need post-humanism to kind of see that. But I think posthumanism helps you to see two things in addition to that, that you might not notice as easily when you don't use this posthumanist framework. The first thing is this idea that, this machine is not simply a tool or a resource used by, who knows, the manager of the foundry or someone else to kind of exercise power or something like this. Like, as I said, like once the machine is out there, it has agency on its own. It starts living its own life, and it doesn't mean that it's completely unrelated to this person who once put a machine there or whatever. But it's like this machine has agency on its own, and it does things that maybe have nothing to do with whatever intentions were there once. So I think that's something that the posthumanist perspective adds. The second thing is then to think about language a bit more broadly. That as a non-posthumanist scholar, you might not consider that idea of like, oh, whenever I stand and walk somewhere where I'm not supposed to, this machine turns itself off. That's something you might kind of push aside a little bit and think like, okay, that's not language, or that's maybe context, or that's not really relevant. And when you start thinking with these posthumanist concepts and everything, you might notice those kind of things more, or you might consider them more relevant, and you might just think like, oh, this is actually also part of language. So I would say like these are two things when it comes to the data that the posthumanist perspective can help you do, on top of the other things that you might already notice on the basis of previous theoretical insights from linguistics. Then when it comes to methodology, I will keep this brief then, because I feel I'm talking long now. When it comes to methodology, I think posthumanism kind of stresses even more than before the importance of also using video recordings. It's not sufficient to only rely on audio all the time. I've done this partly, of course, but I think. I think there's so much going on that involves more than just audio. So I think it stresses even more like how important it is to also use video recordings for your data. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very, very much. Very quick follow-up question. So would you then say that one inevitable consequence of this approach is that you will need to engage transdisciplinary research, both in terms of theories and methods?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I completely understood.
Sorry. So would you say that one kind of an inevitable consequence of applying posthumanist approach is that you need to then engage transdisciplinary research in terms of theories and methods?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's I think that's also one of the propositions in the end. Like I needed to make this list with 10 propositions that is now included in this list. And one of the propositions I wrote was like that posthumanist and other like linguistic, social linguistic concepts, that they should be productively related to each other. So I'm not here arguing that we should abandon all kind of the concepts that we've already developed in the fields of linguistics and social linguistics, such as community of practice. Like I think those are still very useful concepts and they still help us a lot. What posthumanism can help us with is to enrich those concepts a bit more, to think about different ways to think about those concepts. And I would certainly not say that we should abandon them and just go completely posthumanist. I think that would be a waste of every previous work that has been done. So, yeah. So sure, transdisciplinarity is very important.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Camilla Wiede, who holds a chair in Scandinavian languages at the University of Turku in Finland.
Thank you. And I hope I will stay online because Zoom just kicked me out a couple of minutes ago, but my question will then be read to you. I want to agree with all the others that this is really, it's been a pleasure to read your thesis, and I'm very happy that I could be part of this examination. And it was said before, but one thing which I found really inspiring is that you write in a very easy way about complicated things, and I think that's something that you don't see all the time in academia. But it was a very pleasant experience to read it, but you also address really interesting questions, and as it has been said here before, in a new way, and you put together things that are complicated but make them seem fairly easy to understand. And one thing which I found highly inspiring was the way you talk about language policy, and you say on page 71 that all language policy mechanisms can be regarded as different forms of linguistic landscaping. And I had two questions about this, but I want to now focus on the second one, which is actually about Limburgish, because you wrote, it was really, I come from a multilingual country myself with several languages and several dialects and regional varieties. And I found it really interesting how Limburgish was used in this setting as well. And when you now, your results, what I would like just ask you the question about how you can actually adopt your results. So when you've seen how also Limburgish is in this multilingual setting, what would be your most important conclusion about this perspective for future research of multilingualism? How should we also consider the internal variation of the languages? This is I think you had some really interesting results there. So it's just for you to reflect on what do you see, how could this affect how we look at multilingualism and language policy?
Alle esteemed opponents, tack så mycket för dina ord, för din fråga. To rephrase also to make sure that I understood the question correctly. So you're asking me to reflect upon the variation within Limburgish and how that plays a role in the mental foundry.
No, I'm actually thinking about how when we're talking about language policy and how we write language policies, we usually think about several languages, but we also have regional languages, dialects, and you have some really interesting results when you look at linguistic landscapes where you can actually see how they all play together. So I'm just if you could now see how would the language policy also adopt that perspective? What would be, if you can change the theories, what would be your message?
Thank you very much for this question. Okay, I think I understand what you're trying to say now. So I talk about language policy as language policy mechanisms, as you said also, and language policy mechanisms. Yeah, I consider them then also as a kind of affordances that enable you to do certain things or encourage you to do certain things as opposed to others. So if we think about language and communication more broadly, then we can also think about language policy in that sense more broadly and think about all the mechanisms that are out there and that can help us kind of facilitate communication in the workplace or kind of enable effective communication in the workplace. So that also kind of then brings us to this idea that language policy is about more than just language. And I think I think already as a linguist, we are already kind of aware of this idea that there's a difference between speaking Dutch and speaking Dutch. Like you can speak Dutch with some kind of attitude like, okay, you just have to understand me. Yeah, like I just talk to you and you just whatever, like it's up to you to make sure that you understand me. But you can also speak Dutch in a way where you kind of take this other person a bit more into account and try to accommodate, as I also tried to do in my presentation, try to point out a bit, accommodate to try to include different audience, even when you're actually speaking kind of sort of Dutch, but then not this entire language or whatever. So that's something that we're already used to as linguists. And I think from this post-humanist perspective, I think you can even think about that even more broadly, like, okay, it's not only about accommodating in terms of language, it's accommodating in all sorts of ways, also with all the technologies in the workplace, like that you can think about this more broadly about language policy to kind of see like how are there all kind of different ways that we can, through all kind of affordances, enable people to have a bit more effective communication in the workplace. So I think there this idea of language policy mechanisms actually helps quite a lot. So well, actually, it's your question made me think like, okay, maybe this is something I should sometimes write about. I don't know. It's thank you very much.
Tack så mycket, det var ett fint svar.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to give the floor to our external guest, Professor Pennycook.
For a second question. Okay, I think it'll have to be very quick. And maybe it carries on from part of what Sari and Camille have been asking. So you give all this background to language varieties, Limburgish, Dutch, English, German, Polish, and so on. And then you talk a lot about assemblages, humans and non-humans, particularly machines. One of the things I'm still trying to grasp in my own work, and I'd like to hear how you think about that, is how do we understand this relationship between language variety, whatever, the kind of linguistic bits, and the where do they fit into an assemblage? That's my question.
Thank you very much for this question. I think it's more a matter of extending some kind of ideas that we're already used to. I think like in non-post-humanist kind of discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis, we're already kind of used to this idea that language in a way has agency on its own a bit. Like that's like once we create some categories or distinctions or words, that these also kind of start to live a life on their own, and that they enable us to do certain things, they encourage us to do certain things, they enable us to think in certain categories, like, I don't know, Dutchman or German or something like that, and that they also encourage us to think in these categories. So from discourse analysis and all that, we're already kind of used to this. And I think it's just like we can broaden that idea a bit more by also just thinking like, okay, as of course, there's all these other resources that also do that. And actually language is not too different from that. Linguistic resources, they are very similar to other resources out there. They don't have to be this very special category out there. They are doing something that all kind of other things around us in daily life are also doing. They enable us to do certain things. They encourage us to do certain things, and they live a bit of life on their own. They exist also a bit independent from us. So I think this is what it can help us. Maybe you have a follow-up question on that, or
Do I have time?
That answers your question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just wanted, you said they kind of like other things. Of course, they, particularly from the humanist position, they're really not. And I wonder, how similar and how different are they? But that's a whole other question to get into.
We can talk about it later.
I think that's a better suggestion.
Please use a microphone.
You want to still elaborate a little bit on this question? Maybe not.
I will very slowly start with answer.
I have to use the microphone. My apologies. Daan Hovens, the time appointing for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
We hebben weer geen last van. Dus het ging hartstikke goed. Leuk. Wie vond het zelf?
Ja, ik vond het vooral en afsluiten ging het goed gewoon. De presentatie, ik was heel erg nerveus. Ik weet niet, de presentatie weet ik niet.
Dat was net, ja.
Ja. Later. So don't forget to bring the book. Forget later.
I mean, one of the things that I discovered after the first 2 or 3 rounds was the strategies I had decided to use at the beginning work because they were too inconsistent and confusing. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Oh yeah, I mean, what he was especially interested in was that they have these particles with independent tense and continuity, but there is a lot. But most of the lexicon they use particularly kind of more morphology with something that didn't have much time to question. And we're looking at how these morphemes are performing certain functions within the sentence that couldn't be connected in any way to English, but were clearly connected to some other languages. Yes, I would have actually that very often when you use these kind of connecting or marking words, like next or connection levels, you tend to do those, they seem like German words rather than deliberation. With that gave us an anchor and we kind of went back into English. Yeah, so I would also say like what I did. It's interesting that the kind of civil aging and remember from the very first exercise where you were not and I think one of the basic concept of the and it's discussed in a traditional British school. And she said, and he said, listen how she said, what? And she adapted to English. She spoke and she used it to pass into English. But by the time she gets to the next sentence, she doesn't say what she's submitted. Where I want to be. And then she gets into it and she gets the kind of the English things fall away, which gets more and more into the real. Because she's more relaxed and she's not paying attention to the and I remember him talking about how he adjusted every situation depending on who was talking to him. Although one of the things that really struck me with my son, who grew up in Hungary after the age of I can remember an occasion when our family and family class met his classmates' young brother, who was a year younger than my son. So my son was only 6, a little bit over 5. And these are two boys who are both on computer. And I was surprised that this boy was 5 years old. Said to me, shall we speak in the air? That he was so clear in mind that this is one I can see, which was only used. And if they, the problems at home intended, we That's also a really interesting question. Whether when you've got languages that are so far apart, that it is, I don't think it's difficult to do extraction. When you've got languages so far apart, I mean, Hindi and English is one of the best examples. And the two languages are hard. I remember Chinese French people nobody speaks Mandarin. Everybody speaks Mandarin to sleep, but nobody speaks it. Everybody has their own dialect. And the only time to speak Mandarin is if the husband is from northern China and the wife is from southern China and they can't understand it. No, but in China there was no such thing as education. I mean, certainly Cantonese is recognized. So, in Taiwan, education is about to be another. So still, education happens in another. But they use the old characters, use the. Oh, yes. Yes, and I can just imagine that still happening. When I was there, we had all sorts of draconian punishments for university students who stepped out of
Dear Daan Hovens, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Kornips is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor now to take the floor.
Is it working? Yes. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible? You have to say yes.
Yes, I will.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon online and on-site, of course, I hereby confer upon you, Daan Hovens, cum laude, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor affixed with the official seal of the university and shown by the beadle. But that's me now. Cum laude, Daan. Wel edel, zeer geleerde Daan, lieve Daan. Daan. We are here all so proud, but I will continue in Dutch. Namens al je promotoren ga ik je natuurlijk ontzettend feliciteren met dit, zoals het genoemd is, net high risk, high gain proefschrift. Zeer inspirerend, vernieuwend, erudiet. En mijn felicitaties gelden natuurlijk ook je partner en de familie hier aanwezig. Dr. Daan, wat begon als een gewoon proefschrifttraject. Waar ga ik naartoe? Wat zal ik doen? Hoe gaat mijn veldwerk eruit zien? De eerste versie van een artikel waar we vele versies van gezien hebben. Opeens was er magie in het spel. Het begon allemaal heel gebruikelijk en dan na een jaar of 2 opeens begon je ons te ontgroeien, leek wel. Ik weet niet wie jou aangeraakt heeft, of je dat zelf gedaan hebt, maar er kwam een enorme versnelling in je denken. Een enorme versnelling in reflecties. Ik weet niet precies wat dat veroorzaakt heeft. Misschien omdat je als een van de weinige PhD's je BKO gehaald hebt. Je hebt heel veel onderwijs gegeven. Daardoor heel veel stukken en verslagen van andere studenten moeten lezen. Misschien heeft dat ook jouw reflectie nogmaals verdiept. Misschien de winterschool in Kopenhagen. Waar je allemaal zeer gelijkgezinde peers ontmoeten. Maar goed, na die eerste 2 jaar groeide je uit tot werkelijk een fenomenale onderzoeker die je nu bent. Je hebt ons promotoren alle hoeken laten zien van ons denken. Om met je mee te gaan. Echt ongelooflijk inspirerend. Wat ik denk de grootste kwaliteit vind van jou als onderzoeker is dat je een ongelooflijk integere onderzoeker bent. En ik denk dat we binnen de academie nog heel veel van je kunnen leren. En met integer bedoel ik natuurlijk iedereen verzamelt data. Jij hebt nooit op geen enkel moment die data geweld aan gedaan om ze ergens te fitten in een theorie. Je hebt de data gelaten en je bent van het ene concept naar het andere concept gegaan om de data werkelijk volkomen tot een recht te laten komen. En zo kon het dus zijn dat we bij de eerste versie van een artikel hadden we concept A uit discipline A. En bij de tweede versie volkomen herschreven, zelfs onder tijdnood, concept B vanuit een volledige andere linguïstische discipline. Je hebt ons werkelijk alle hoeken en gaten heb je ons meegenomen. Echt bewonderingswaardig. Op een gegeven moment zei ik ook tegen jou, ik geloof in je 3e of in je 4e jaar, maar waarom vraag je ons advies nog? Je weet het ondertussen beter dan wij. Dus een beter compliment kan ik je niet geven. Je proefschrift startte met de simpele vraag die gesteld was binnen de vacature. Hoe meertaligheid op de werkvloer in het Nederlands-Duitse grensgebied vorm en inhoud zou krijgen. En in de vacature stond er de vraag, nou ja, wordt er gecoacht? Is er taalkeuze? Wordt er gemengd? Is er lingua franca? Is er luistertaal aanwezig? Daar begonnen we mee. Nou, als je dus ziet wat je proefschrift is geworden, dat is veel meer dan een antwoord op die hele inventariserende vraag. Je gaat uit van een zeer gedurfd posthumanistisch kader, dat nog maar mondjesmaat in de sociolinguïstiek wordt bedreven. Ik denk dat alleen Alistair Pennycook hier daar mee bezig is. Gelukkig hebben we collega's binnen onze vakgroep, zoals Louis van der Hengel, hier ook aanwezig, die gelukkig ook expert is. En het geeft ook aan hoe inspirerend onze kapgroep en onze faculteit is, om juist ook die linguïstiek overschrijdend te maken buiten de disciplinegrenzen. Nou, je innoveert bestaande theoretische concepten zoals talig landschap. Je durft het aan om mens-machine interactie centraal te stellen. Dus het is een uitdagend proefschrift geworden. En ik hoop werkelijk dat het internationaal ook zal landen als een proefschrift dat absoluut navolging verdient. Daan, ik mis het nu al, de afgelopen maanden, om je hoofdstukken te lezen, om met je van gedachten te wisselen, je altijd afgewogen en wijze woorden als je spreekt, vooral tijdens de vergaderingen van levende talen Limburgs. Ik hoop natuurlijk dat we in de toekomst blijven samenwerken. Niet meer als een promotor en PhD's, maar als twee elkaar respecterende collega's. En ik wil natuurlijk alle promotoren bedanken. En ik geef het woord natuurlijk aan professor Suzanne Tienke, die het tweede deel van de dotatie zal doen.
I would like to share my view on supervising Daan. What a journey. What a wonderful intellectual journey.
Sorry.
But he's traveling now as well. Oh, okay. I'm very lucky, happy, and proud to have been part of it, of this wonderful journey. Let me tell the development. Daan is the first student who I followed from the master's thesis to the defense of the doctoral dissertation today. Even if I agree that Daan was a bit worried and cautious in the first time of his PhD, which is pretty normal, I think, I would like to stress that he was an excellent student who turned into an excellent mature researcher. It has all been there from the beginning, ready to flourish. On October 15th in 2012, I wrote my assessment for Daan's master thesis, and I read it again now. I there argued that the study was an original contribution to the field of European integration studies and even to the field of multilingualism. It showed very clearly that Europe happens on the grassroots level, and the grassroots level still matters to you. I also concluded that there was no doubt that Hovens was deeply dedicated to the core issues of a Eurocultural program, cultural and social development, the political process of European integration, values, citizenship, and cultural identity. All this, I would claim, is still the case and obvious to all of us who have read Daan's work. More surprising, though, are maybe my comments on the methods of the master thesis, where I highlighted the skillfulness in the area of quantitative analysis and how convincing this was. As we all know, Daan, you have chosen other approaches in this PhD. This depends therefore not, as he has shown in earlier works, on capacity or lack of capacity. It depends on his genuine sensitiveness towards the data and the will to look beyond. The very long and sometimes exhausting period of fieldwork in a metal foundry, meeting real people, led to the very high level of reflection of which we can see the proof in his work today. In Swedish, we can say that someone has gone through a steel bath, meaning getting cooked and get out afterwards stronger and harder. I think the metal foundry literally has been this steel bath to Daan. When looking for explanation what he saw in the data, Daan found the perfect match in the field of posthumanism theory, and I'm grateful that I learned a lot during this all the time. Daan combines, I think, posthumanism with decency, gentleness, and patience, very important skills in science, I would say. So the supervision sessions, what were they like? We had there in the beginning, I think they were most about daring and about caring, then about finding one's own way in the research jungle. The main question, at least I had always, was, what do you want? What do you think? And what do you have to make things happen? Und ich glaube, aufgrund dieser Fragen, Daan, Entschuldigung, wir haben immer Deutsch gesprochen, bist du genau dieser wunderbare, vollendete Forscher geworden, der heute vor uns steht. Vielen, vielen Dank, dass ich auf der Reise dabei sein durfte. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Dr. Daan Hovens. Sounds good, right? Also, on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the great honor you have acquired. Not sure you realized you got cum laude. Huh? That is something very, very special. So enjoy today. We will still have the honor to take a picture with Daan here in the aula and also together with the committee that is here online. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you also for the other committee members for joining us. And we will then have a reception in the Refta where we will celebrate Daan and his supervisors. Thank you. And I now declare this ceremony closed.